The silence hit before the words ever did. Thick, heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. First class had that kind of silence, polite smiles frozen in place, crystal glasses touching softly, leather seats holding people who were used to being comfortable, used to being certain of where they belonged. And then she stepped into the aisle, and the silence sharpened like a blade. She stood there, holding her boarding pass with both hands, not shaking, not rushed, just still. A black woman in a tailored coat, hair neat, posture straight, calm in a way that didn't ask for approval, invisible in a way that felt practiced, like she had learned long ago how to stand inside a room that refused to see her. The flight attendant glanced up for half a second, just enough to register confusion, not enough to register respect. Her eyes slid past the woman as if she were an obstacle, not a person. Somewhere behind her, a man in a charcoal suit let out a loud, impatient sigh, the kind that wasn't accidental, the kind meant to be heard. Another passenger smirked without shame, lips curling as if the moment amused him. And then came the whisper, low, sharp, she must be lost. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed anyway, heavy, certain, final. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She didn't scan the cabin for allies. She stepped forward and slid into the window seat. First class, seat 2A. The leather was cool beneath her fingers as she adjusted herself, placing her bag carefully under the seat in front of her. She buckled in slowly, deliberately, as if she had done this 100 times before, as if she belonged, because she did. But belonging is not always something others are willing to recognize. The flight attendant froze for a beat. Her smile tightened, stretched thin like it had been pulled too far. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to keep it private. "Ma'am," she said, eyes flicking down and then back up again. "Economy is in the back." The woman turned her head just enough to meet her gaze. Her face was calm, her eyes steady. "This is my seat," she said. No edge, no apology, just fact. A pause followed, the kind that feels longer than it is. A stare passed between them. Then a soft laugh rippled through the cabin. Not loud, not cruel on the surface, but dismissive, dangerous. The kind of laughter that tells you the verdict has already been reached. Phones began to rise, slowly at first, then more confidently. Screens glowing, cameras angled, eyes judging, measuring, deciding. She felt all of it settle onto her shoulders. The weight of being seen as an error, a disruption, a mistake that needed correcting. She could have argued. She could have raised her voice. She could have waved her boarding pass in the air and demanded respect. But she didn't. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced, back straight, eyes forward. Silence wrapped around her like armor. That restraint confused them more than anger ever could. The attendant stood there a moment longer, clearly unsure. This wasn't how these moments usually went. There was no panic, no pleading, no shame, just calm resistance, just a woman sitting where she knew she belonged. Around her, the whispers grew bolder. "They always do this," someone muttered. "Trying to get something they didn't pay for," another voice added. Each comment felt like a pin dropped onto her skin. Small, sharp, accumulating. She stared straight ahead, past the window, past the wing, past the tarmac stretching endlessly beyond the glass. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Slow, controlled. She had learned this skill long before this flight. Learned it in rooms where she was underestimated. In meetings where her ideas were repeated louder by someone else. In spaces where her presence alone was questioned. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cheerful and unaware. A welcome aboard. A reminder to stow carry-ons. A promise of smooth skies ahead. But the tension didn't lift. It thickened. It pressed into the spaces between words and glances. Because humiliation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lives quietly in assumptions, in the way eyes slide past you, in the way silence can be used as a weapon. The flight attendant stepped away, whispering urgently to someone near the galley. A few passengers leaned back, satisfied, as if the problem was being handled, as if order was being restored. The woman remained still. Her phone vibrated against her thigh. It was subtle, almost missed, but she felt it instantly. The small hum cut through the tension like a thread being pulled loose. She lowered her gaze to her lap, eyes flicking down just long enough to see the screen light up. She didn't react. No widening of the eyes, no smile, no sign of relief. She simply let the phone rest where it was, screen glowing softly against the fabric of her coat. Across the aisle, a man watched her too closely, waiting, expecting something, a crack, a reveal. But there was nothing, just quiet. The flight attendant returned, this time with a sharper tone. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see your boarding pass," she said, holding out her hand. The woman lifted her eyes, slowly, calmly. She reached into her bag and pulled out the paper, placing it gently into the attendant's palm. The attendant scanned it once, then again, her brow furrowed. Around them, first class leaned in. The laughter had stopped, replaced by curiosity, suspicion. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The attendant frowned. "Just one moment," she said, voice no longer certain. She turned and walked away, the boarding pass still in her hand. The woman exhaled quietly, not in relief, in patience. Her phone vibrated again. This time she picked it up. She glanced at the name on the screen. The corners of her mouth didn't move. Her expression remained unchanged. She answered the call and brought the phone to her ear. "Yes," she said softly. The words seemed to echo louder than any whisper had before. She listened, nodded once. Her gaze stayed forward, unfocused, as if she were listening to something far beyond the cabin walls. "I'm seated," she said. A pause. "Yes, on the plane." A few heads turned. The man in the charcoal suit leaned forward slightly, interest replacing annoyance. The woman across the aisle stopped pretending not to watch. She lowered the phone back into her lap and ended the call. Still calm, still composed, still silent. But something had shifted. The flight attendant returned again, this time with a supervisor. The supervisor's face was tight, pale. She looked at the boarding pass, then at the woman, then back at the boarding pass. Her mouth opened, closed. The cabin waited. The woman remained still, hands folded, eyes forward, as if none of this touched her, as if she had already moved past this moment in her mind. The supervisor cleared her throat. "Ma'am," she began, her voice different now, careful, controlled. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." A ripple passed through the cabin, not relief, something closer to unease. The woman finally turned her head, meeting the supervisor's eyes. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply waited. The supervisor swallowed. "Please accept our apologies," she said quietly. Silence fell again, heavier than before. The woman nodded once, just once, and turned back toward the window. Outside, the plane began to move, slowly, deliberately, taxiing toward the runway. Inside, first class sat frozen, trapped in the realization that they had been wrong, that they had judged too quickly, that they had assumed power and worth based on appearance and comfort and skin. The woman watched the ground slide past the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Calm, composed, no victory dance, no speech, just presence. Because sometimes the strongest statement is simply staying seated when the world tells you to move. The supervisor came back down the aisle with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile meant to calm a situation without actually fixing it. The kind used when someone in authority already believes they are right. She stopped beside the seat and folded her hands together, posture stiff, chin lifted just enough to signal control. The flight attendant hovered beside her, arms crossed now, confidence borrowed from hierarchy. Polite words followed, but the tone was cold, measured, distant. as if the woman in the seat were a problem to be solved, not a person to be heard. "Ma'am," the supervisor said softly, but not kindly, "we just need to confirm a few things." Confirm. That word carried weight. It meant she was still under suspicion. It meant the boarding pass in her hand wasn't enough. It meant her presence required validation. They asked again and again. For proof, for justification, for permission to exist in a space that clearly didn't expect her. Each question landed like a tap on glass. Not loud, not explosive, but relentless, wearing her down inch by inch. Around her, first class leaned in, subtle at first, then openly. Curiosity replaced annoyance. People shifted in their seats, bodies angled toward the drama. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her companion and muttered, "They're getting bold these days." The words slid out casually, like gossip, like observation, like something that didn't carry harm. But they did. They always did. A man 2 rows back shook his head slowly. "Always playing the victim," he said, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant for her. She felt the words settle into her chest, heavy, familiar. She had heard them before, in offices, in stores, in rooms where she had to prove she deserved to be there before she could even speak. But she said nothing. Silence wrapped around her again, tighter this time. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something they didn't. Silence was her shield. The supervisor cleared her throat. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we could look into rebooking you." She paused, choosing her words with care. "Just to avoid any inconvenience." Inconvenience for whom? The question burned quietly behind the woman's eyes. She could feel her chest tighten, breath shortening just slightly. But her face remained calm, composed. She reached into her bag again and handed over her boarding pass without a word. The paper felt thin, fragile, like it shouldn't have to carry this much weight. The supervisor scanned it, once, then again. Her brow creased. She scanned it a third time, slower now, too long. Still doubt lingered. Because systems can confirm seats, screens can flash green, barcodes can beep approval, but respect doesn't come from machines. And the lack of it was still thick in the air. The flight attendant leaned closer to the supervisor and whispered something. The supervisor nodded, lips pressed together, eyes flicking back to the woman as if she were trying to read her, trying to find the flaw, the trick, the lie that would justify everything they already believed. A nearby passenger scoffed openly. "If she belonged here," he said, shaking his head, "she wouldn't be so quiet." That one landed harder than the rest. Because dignity is often mistaken for weakness. Because calm is seen as guilt when it comes in the wrong skin. Because silence, when chosen, is read as surrender instead of strength. Her hands tightened together for just a moment, then loosened. She kept her gaze forward, out the window, at the slow crawl of the plane as it waited on the tarmac. She focused on the steady hum beneath her feet, the vibration of the engines, the grounding reminder that she was real, that she was here, that she existed beyond their assumptions. The supervisor straightened. "Ma'am," she said, voice firmer. "If you don't cooperate, we may have to escalate this." Escalate. Another heavy word. A threat wrapped in policy. The flight attendant leaned in closer. "We're just trying to help," she added, tone sharp beneath the smile. "But we need you to work with us." The woman finally turned her head, just slightly, enough to acknowledge them. Her eyes were steady, clear. "I am cooperating," she said quietly. The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond. Her phone vibrated again. The sound was small, almost nothing, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The woman glanced down at her lap, where the screen lit up softly. The supervisor noticed it too. Her eyes narrowed. "Ma'am," the supervisor said quickly, "we'll need you to put that away." The woman didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She simply lifted the phone and answered the call. "Yes," she said, voice low, controlled, respectful. The cabin went still. She listened for a moment, nodding slightly. "I'm on the plane now," she continued. "Yes, First class. The words hung in the air. The supervisor's face changed, not all at once, but slowly, like color draining from a photograph. Her posture stiffened, her confidence wavered. She took a small step back, as if she had misjudged the ground beneath her feet. Passengers noticed. The whispers stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered. Eyes widened. The woman continued speaking, her tone unchanged. Calm, professional. "Yes," she said again. "There seems to be some confusion." A pause. "I understand." She ended the call and placed the phone back in her lap. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't mocking. It was uncertain, uneasy. The supervisor swallowed hard. She glanced at the flight attendant, then back at the woman, then down at the boarding pass still clutched in her hand. Her grip tightened, loosened. "I just need to check something," the supervisor said quickly, voice suddenly too polite, too careful. She turned and hurried up the aisle, heels clicking faster than before. The flight attendant followed, no longer confident, no longer sure. A low murmur rippled through first class. People shifted, looked at one another, replayed their words in their heads. The smirk on one man's face faded. The woman who had muttered earlier stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The woman in seat 2A remained still, her breathing steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She stared out the window, but her reflection stared back at her. Calm, unbothered, untouched, or so it seemed. Inside, memories stirred. Old moments, old rooms, old doubts placed on her shoulders by people who had never earned the right to question her. She had learned long ago that power rarely announces itself. It waits, it watches, and when it speaks, it doesn't need to shout. The supervisor returned, face pale now, steps slower. She stopped beside the seat and cleared her throat, but no sound came out at first. She tried again. "Ma'am," she said, voice trembling just slightly, "there appears to have been a misunderstanding." The word hung there, heavy, incomplete. The woman turned her head and met her gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She simply looked at her, a long look. A look that held every assumption that had been made in the last 10 minutes. "I see," the woman said softly. The supervisor nodded quickly. "We apologize for the inconvenience," she said. Her voice dropped. "Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." Comfortable? The irony tasted bitter in the air. The woman nodded once, just once, and turned back toward the window. The supervisor stepped away. The flight attendant followed, eyes downcast now. First class sat frozen. The power had shifted, but no one knew exactly how or why. They only knew that something they couldn't see had just changed everything. The plane began to move again, rolling forward slowly, engines humming louder, the promise of takeoff drawing closer. The woman closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in victory, not in relief, but in preparation. Because whatever had just begun was far from over. The supervisor didn't walk away this time. She retreated. Her steps were slower, uneven, like the ground beneath her had changed shape without warning. She disappeared toward the front of the cabin, whispering urgently into a phone, her shoulders tense, her free hand shaking just enough to be noticed. First class watched her go, confusion rippling quietly from seat to seat. No one spoke, no one laughed. The air felt thinner now, like something important was happening just out of view. The woman in seat 2A remained still, hands folded, back straight, eyes forward. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, calm and unreadable. Inside, her heartbeat was steady, not racing, not triumphant, just present. She had learned long ago that moments like this didn't need celebration. They needed patience. When the supervisor returned, she looked different, smaller somehow. Her face had lost its color. The practiced authority had drained from her posture, leaving behind something raw and human. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in front of her. She cleared her throat twice before finding her voice. "Ma'am," she said quietly, the word finally carrying respect, "we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." The sentence landed like a dropped glass, fragile, loud in its silence. Eyes widened across the cabin. Smirks vanished. The man in the charcoal suit stiffened, his confident posture collapsing into discomfort. The woman who had whispered earlier pressed her lips together, staring straight ahead as if the seat in front of her suddenly demanded all her attention. Phones that had been raised now lowered, screens dimming. The apology hung there incomplete, without explanation, without accountability. But it was something, more than what had come before. Before the woman could respond, a new presence filled the aisle. The cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out, tall, calm, commanding in a way that didn't need volume. His uniform was crisp, his movements deliberate. The chatter that had begun to stir died instantly. He didn't address the cabin, he addressed her. He stopped beside her seat, meeting her eyes with a look that held recognition, not curiosity. "Thank you for flying with us today," he said. His voice was steady, respectful, warm. There was no performance in it, no forced politeness, just truth. A murmur rippled through first class, like a wave moving across water. The captain continued, "We're honored to have you on board." Honored. The words settled into the space between them and changed everything. People shifted in their seats, backs straightened, shoulders pulled back. The same passengers who had leaned in earlier now leaned away, as if distance could erase what they had already revealed. A few exchanged glances, silent questions passing between them. "Who is she? What did we miss?" The supervisor stood frozen, eyes flicking between the captain and the woman, as if watching a reality she hadn't prepared for. The truth moved faster than whispers now. It didn't need help. It didn't need explanation, but it came anyway. The call had been from the airline's board office, not customer service, not a complaint line. The board. The woman wasn't just a passenger. She was the lead architect behind the airline's new safety systems, the mind that had redesigned protocols, the voice that had challenged old methods, the reason half the people sitting in those seats trusted this aircraft with their lives. Every smooth ascent, every stable landing, every safety announcement that had become routine. Her work was woven into it all. The woman who had been ignored had built the future they relied on. Recognition spread slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. Faces changed, eyes softened, some with shock, some with shame, some with sudden, eager admiration that felt too late to matter. A man leaned forward, clearing his throat. "I didn't realize," he began, words stumbling over each other. Another passenger offered a tight smile. "We're just glad to have you with us," she said, as if that could undo what had already been done. Apologies spilled out awkwardly, half-formed, rushed, the kind that come from discomfort more than understanding. They searched her face for forgiveness, for reassurance, for permission to feel better about themselves. She didn't give it. She nodded once, not to accept, not to reject, just to acknowledge. The captain held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded back. A silent exchange of respect between two people who understood what it meant to carry responsibility without recognition. He turned and returned to the cockpit, the door closing softly behind him. The supervisor exhaled shakily. "Please let us know if there's anything at all you need," she said, voice still unsteady. "Anything." The woman looked at her, eyes calm, voice even. "Thank you," she said, 2 words, measured, complete. The supervisor stepped away, her authority restored but forever changed. The flight attendant followed, no longer avoiding the woman's gaze, but unable to hold it for long. First class sat in silence again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavy with realization, with the uncomfortable truth that respect had only arrived once power was revealed, that dignity had been denied until status made it undeniable. The woman turned back toward the window. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, engines growing louder, vibrations humming through the cabin. Outside, the sky stretched wide and open, unaware of the small human reckoning taking place inside the metal shell. She thought about how many times this had happened before. Not this exact moment, but the pattern of it. Being underestimated, being questioned, being forced to prove worth before being granted basic courtesy. She had learned to carry herself with quiet strength because noise had never protected her. Truth had. Power had flipped, not with shouting, not with rage, not with threats, but with truth. The people around her felt it. They felt the shift settle into their bones. Some leaned back, humbled. Others stared out their windows, avoiding the mirror that moment held up to them. The plane paused at the edge of the runway. Engines roared. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, confident and clear, guiding them toward takeoff. As the aircraft surged forward, the woman closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the lift, the moment when gravity loosened its grip. Below them the ground fell away, and with it the weight of being unseen, if only for now. But the lesson remained, hanging in the air long after the wheels left the earth, because truth has a way of traveling farther than any plane ever could. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, when no one knows what to say anymore because too much has already been revealed. First class no longer felt light or effortless. It felt heavy, charged. Every movement seemed louder than it needed to be. A fork touching a plate, a seatbelt clicking, a breath taken too sharply. Those who had judged her earlier now stared down at their trays as if the meals in front of them required deep concentration. Eyes that once watched her, with suspicion, refused to lift again. The man in the charcoal suit poked at his food without appetite, jaw tight, shoulders stiff, replaying his own words in his head. The woman who had whispered about her leaned her forehead against the window, watching the clouds pass by, shame sitting quietly beside her like an unwanted passenger. The flight attendant moved through the aisle with careful steps, her professionalism suddenly fragile. She avoided eye contact now, not out of anger, out of embarrassment. Each time she passed seat 2A, her gaze slid away at the last second, as if looking directly at the woman might remind her of a version of herself she didn't want to face. And the woman in that seat noticed everything. She noticed the silence, the distance, the subtle shift in the air. But she didn't absorb it. She didn't let it define her. She rested her hands in her lap and stared out the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the glass. Blue fading into white, white fading into nothing. As the plane began its descent, the lights dimmed softly. The hum of the engines changed pitch, a gentle reminder that every journey eventually moves toward an ending. The woman closed her eyes, not in victory, not in pride, but in reflection. She thought about how close humiliation had come to touching her, how easily it could have gone differently, how many times in her life it already had. She thought about younger versions of herself, standing in rooms where she wasn't expected, learning how to speak with calm instead of rage, with patience instead of fear. She hadn't needed to prove herself today, and that was the quiet truth that mattered most. She already was enough. The plane descended through layers of cloud, sunlight breaking through in soft flashes. Below them, the city appeared, small and orderly, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had unfolded miles above it. The woman breathed in slowly, then out again, grounding herself in the moment. Not because she needed to calm down, but because she wanted to remember how it felt to choose dignity when the world offered disrespect. The captain's voice came over the intercom once more, steady and warm, announcing their arrival. But this time, before the routine words could fade into habit, he added something else. "I'd also like to personally thank one of our guests on board today," he said. The cabin stilled. For her contributions, her professionalism, and her presence. Eyes lifted again, hesitant, curious. The woman opened her eyes. The captain continued, "We are honored to have had you with us." There was no applause, No dramatic reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than noise ever could. Heads nodded, some in respect, some in regret. When the plane touched down, the wheels met the runway with a firm jolt. Reality returned. Phones buzzed back to life. Seatbelts clicked open. Overhead bins popped as people prepared to leave, eager to move on, eager to escape the discomfort of what they had learned about themselves. The woman stood when it was her turn. She retrieved her bag calmly, the same way she had placed it there hours earlier. As she stepped into the aisle, space opened naturally around her now. People shifted aside without being asked. Not because they were told to, because they felt it was right. The captain waited near the cockpit door. When she reached him, he met her eyes and smiled. A real smile this time. "Thank you again," he said quietly. She smiled back. Polite, warm, brief. Then she walked away. No speeches, no explanations, no moment of revenge where she reminded anyone of how wrong they had been. She didn't need it. Her dignity had already spoken louder than anything she could say. Behind her, first class slowly emptied. Passengers filed out carrying more than luggage. Some carried shame. Some carried lessons they hadn't expected to learn on a short flight. Others carried nothing at all, unwilling or unable to reflect. The woman walked through the terminal with steady steps, blending into the movement of people coming and going, another face in the crowd. And yet she was unchanged by their recognition, because her worth had never depended on it. That was the lesson none of them had been prepared for. This was never about status, never about first class or economy, never about titles or seats or who could afford what. It was about assumptions, about the quiet, dangerous habit of deciding who someone is before they ever speak, about the way power often mistakes itself for truth. You never know who someone is by where you think they belong. The most dangerous mistake power makes is underestimating quiet strength, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that waits patiently while the world exposes itself. Respect costs nothing, not a dollar, not a minute, not a seat upgrade, but the lack of it can expose everything.